All right, y'all. Sorry, welcome to this lecture. I have it titled several different things in several different places, but for now it's breaking down the performance/critical style debate and ways to kind of create competition. I sit down and think about this kind of question during cross-ex of like, what is the role of the negative? What does the F do a lot? And so I have kind of written out in form what I think the kind of buildup and kind of construction of competitive AFs are through a kind of varying style of affirmatives, and what opportunities this is provide both to the affirmative from a strategic hat, but also what are some of the kind of light areas that do not happen from the affirmative, and being able to understand its composition that become advantageous for the negative in constructing, constructing negative, competition. So like I said, please ask questions. As I kind of describe this, y'all might realize that my style of kind of talking can sometimes, and I've been working on kind of reducing and paring down the language, but sometimes can be a little convoluted. So when there are questions, I think that also that in some ways brings out my best version of explaining things, because it means that I am speaking at the kind of frequency that you're asking the question at. So please ask your questions and we will move with this. So what are the objectives for this lecture? We've got three. So the first is that it'll provide an insight on the structure and framing of critical affirmatives. Two is that it'll develop strategic vision for deploying different types of critical AFs, and honestly negatives too, depending on what is happening in the debate, what your kind of style of debating is. If you are reading more critical arguments on the negative, if you are reading more performatively critical arguments on the negative and the AF is not, or the AF is reading a bit more straight laced of a critical AF, then this will also be helpful to that type of visioning for the 1AC or 1NC. Three is that it'll point out areas of opportunity for creating competition between the affirmative and negative. So that cross-ex moment that occurs, that's like, what is the role of the negative? And the answer, changes throughout the entirety of the debate, because maybe sometimes the affirmative has done a really good job of thinking why it is important and good, but not necessarily why the debate or the conversation or its kind of, existence within the kind of dialogical structure of debate is good. And so we're going to be really intervening and talking about ways to approach these answers in cross-ex at the level of producing and structuring a 1AC. But for those who are in the Zoom, I am not the best at looking at the chat function. So honestly, it's going to be one of those things where you need to just like say, hey, Jazmine, so that I can, hear you and respond to whatever questions that you may have. So right.
Being recorded?
Yeah, it is being recorded. It is being recorded. So yeah, let's start. So breaking down performance, first thing that I want to start off with, and why I have the word performance in parentheses is or not parentheses, quotation marks, is because I believe inherently that every 1AC is a performance. And that is because you are bringing words to power through individuals who come from different backgrounds and trainings, and thus perform based on these kind of socio-cultural primers, right? Like we think, we tend to think that what the affirmative that is traditional or that is kind of policy is like normative. It is just kind of the introduction of the kind of document of the 1AC and kind of thinking through fiat as a normal means process that has no kind of base or grappling with how does debate view predictable, digestible / acceptable forms of affirmation, and what has that taught the then reader of the 1AC about how it is best or most preferable for them to read the 1AC in a debate. I would locate that as still being a performance, because you are acting in a way that debate has suggested or promoted as being salient, as being sound, as being, accepted. And therefore your expectations, the way that you are thinking about the kind of document of the 1AC that you have been given and exchanging in the round as something mutable or something very kind of like flat and normative, is not just that, but is a performance in and of itself. And the things that code your kind of thought to think it this way is potentially what a kind of more performative style argument on either the negative or the affirmative would gesture for you to think critically about and have to defend. Second is that debate operates in a majoritarian cultural context of formalized rules that set the tone and resonance of performance of particular arguments. So like, what do I mean by majoritarian cultural context? This potentially comes from like me being a poli-sci major, which is ironic because I do not use that degree at all. But when thinking about like democracy and the kind of form and structure of what is a, functioning democracy, what are the tenets of that? A lot of the times the argument is that there is a majoritarian and a minoritarian group within kind of a representative democracy that is able to kind of control or make the dominant decisions for the overall body. And so that majoritarian cultural context typically is the kind of traditional / normative construct of rules that exist in debate that have been accepted by the majority, right? But that this majority tends to also now speak for the minority, and it presents as being the most democratic, right? The agreed upon stasis, if you will, right? For how debate should be thought of, how should debate be debated, how we should be thinking about what is, good ground, bad ground, things to be discussed, things to think about, what affirmation is, et cetera, et cetera. The part that I think is really interesting, right, is this becomes what is the agreed upon of everyone in the most rational way of getting to agreement, but ignores the intricacies of the minoritarian, right? Why they are projected as the minoritarian, and what does it mean for us to kind of divorce this kind of acceptance and this kind of static thought of commonplace thinking in debate and open up for folks who want to press or create some pressure against this kind of traditional form of thinking about debating. The last, and that is understanding where your arguments reside within the mores of debate, will be important for creating strategic and interrogative strategies in debates that apply pressure to the socioculture. And this is going to be a really big part of this lecture, is that I think that a lot of affirmative that I see both in college and in high school, but I'll speak to college, is that everyone wants to be right about like the theory. Everyone wants to say that they have introduced, the kind of correct way or observation in rounds for how we should understand the topic, how we should understand the space, et cetera, but has not applied any kind of significance as to what this means in the context of like how debate operates. It's always a move to be correct in the context of the resolution or correct in the context of responding to the negative, and not why the kind of disruption that the 1AC presents in the round is something significant, and that the alternative to not disrupting is something that should be, discussed and has, negative consequences, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of like the three tenets for kind of breaking down what I mean by performance, but also two, what is the kind of stage that we are entering in with a performance / critical affirmative, and then three, understanding the significance of reading these arguments and what entry points these allow for your strategic vision. Are any questions so far about what I am saying? This makes sense. It's digestible. Let me know. Are we good? I'm gonna kind of do a pause for 1, 2, 3. Great. So I didn't hear anything. We move. So the performative affirmative foundation and application. So First is the kind of why and what are you affirming? And so this is kind of going down to the nuts and bolts of constructing the 1AC, turning or translating a thought into the actual kind of documentation of the 1AC before you put the bells and whistles of the method of the affirmative, before you start thinking about it in kind of like a competitive stance, like what and why are you affirming the F? So I would say first that you want to section out the affirmative based in the why and what you are affirming. This will help center the affirmative in whatever socio-cultural formation of majoritarian debate that it either refuses to engage in or is agnostic. Wait, I think I can start seeing, heard you. Thank you. This will help you center the affirmative in whatever sociocultural formation of majoritarian debate that is either refuses to engage in or is agnostic. So what are you saying about debate? What are you saying about the world? Yes. But what are you saying about its application to the way in which debate operates? This is the part that I think, debate has become very sans light on. We just kind of talk about why the world operates this way and less of why debate as a microcosm of the world, right, does this. And what is the kind of theoretical canon that you are using to kind of set up how to view and understand the mechanisms of debate, and why the kind of affirmation of the affirmative, what role does it play in that process? Is it one that refuses to accept or it acknowledges these kind of power struggles, or is it agnostic, right? That the kind of choice of being in tension, and choice of being antagonistic is one that is either futile or is not necessarily the only place that affirmation must be, right? So like this is the whole non-engagement type of performance. You might see these in like the terms of like examples in college, like the cookout or ballroom. Like what are these things relationship to the topic? Probably none insofar as like the form to the resolution and the form of the affirmation. And so it's a bit more agonistic in being non-related, but why that non-relation is key to breaking away from an antagonistic relationship to the resolution and having reasons as to why there should be some other either questions that the debate should be centered around, or why the kind of uniqueness and key factor of breaking from the conversations that debate wants us to have is good, and part of your analysis of the way that debate operates and through whatever canon of scholarship that you are using to set these arguments up. So now the antagonistic versus agonistic dichotomy. So questions to be asked to kind of help put these things into context is, does the affirmation come from negation, or does it posit a separate place and form, or is it a combination of both? So antagonistic would be, in my mind, an affirmation that comes from negation, right? So it's like, these are the things that are repressed by the resolution that we should affirm, or that the resolution stops the ability for some type of discussion to occur. And so therefore we must resist from, performing or debating or accepting certain arguments or, practices in debate because of their kind of repressive tendencies? Or is it more agonistic, right, where it's no longer about necessarily being in contestation to the resolution? Rather, it's a bit more aloof and says that this kind of break from a antagonistic model, one that only understands refutation or understands resistance and being and citing that kind of teleologically, right? Kind of having here is what is being negated, here is how that is done, and here is the goal point of how we know we have succeeded in that negation. Something that is a bit more agonistic doesn't have a success point. It doesn't say that we have done something sufficiently, but that to do something just in its essence is good, and that there should not be these kind of teloses kind of tied to it as in terms of the resolution. It should be tied to something else. What this something else is, what debate looks like in the form of these more kind of performative aspects of debate, or these methods that are not tied to any kind of consequentialism of the resolution. It's up to the affirmative to decide, or up to the negative to decide. Probably a bit more in terms of the affirmative, because the negative doesn't have to be topical anyway, but kind of the role of the affirmative shifting the conversation completely, starting from the 1AC. And third, is there a goal? Determining the endpoint, if that is relevant to your affirmation, is essential and should be based in this kind of alternative socio-cultural context. And I think a lot of time and thought should be put onto this. Is there a goal to the 1AC? Do you have that? Is that something that is in line with the kind of starting point of the AF? If there is not a goal, what does that mean? What does it mean just to have the AF exist? And I would argue that the kind of existence of the AF alone does do something, but rather the debate is whether or not that something should be metricized, right, into the kind of into the way in which debate views successful implementation, or ways to view goal-oriented politics, right? Maybe that's a bad and flawed way to engage in the scholarship that you've introduced in the debate, and having reasons as to why that is the case. Or if there is a goal, right? Knowing that, acknowledging that, and putting that into the kind of way in which you have framed solvency. Right? Like the AF will defend that this is what we do, and this is the kind of endpoint of that. If we win that the endpoint of that is good, then like that is where kind of the debate happens over, does the AF successfully lead to this thing? I think oftentimes the affirmative doesn't know which one it wants to be. In the 1AC, it kind of wants to dance around and go, do we have a goal? Do we not have a goal? Do we just kind of want to be until the negative presses on us, and then we kind of decide after? I think that kind of having an idea of what that is before the round starts is always helpful, and it creates a clearer vision from like a judging perspective too, of how to evaluate the 1AC. Any questions, y'all, before I go to the next slide?
Yeah, can you touch on the difference between antagonistic versus agonistic solvencies more?
Yeah, so antagonistic, so AFs that are like, we refuse to engage in the resolution, right? Or that there is something about the resolution or debate that denies the possibility for something else to occur. And so the kind of solvency of the AF, if you will, is just refusing to abide by the resolution, right? There's not really much that comes after that for the affirmative, because they generally have just they have read a whole bunch of like evidence or made a whole bunch of arguments, right, that prove why the resolution is repressive, and less of, right, what the affirmative does kind of absent that resistance, absent res denies us the ability to do that, and that's bad for all these reasons. This is why this literature allows for us to kind of acknowledge why that's bad, instead of a more agonistic approach, right, that would say, here is what the affirmative does. It's not a question of whether or not the resolution allows or does not allow for those conversations to occur. We're just completely reshifting the debate to be about what we want it to be about, and that should be sufficient. Does that make sense, that distinction? Y'all, other folks rocking with me? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Can I get a bit more confirmation in the chat? I do have the chat open too, so I lied. I can see if folks want to put in the chat that this makes sense or not. Okay. Cool. Perfect. Awesome. Great. So we're going to move to the next slide. Framing. The most underrated part, I believe, from the affirmative that I would like to see a bit more of, that will help in so much in terms of what does the AF actually have to do. Like, I think that a lot of times the affirmative is putting a lot more burden on itself, and trying to both win its kind of like theory and framing, but then also just trying to win the debate in the world of the negative too. And I think that this is where you kind of put yourself in a tough spot, because the negative not only, and if we are assuming a negative that is reading arguments that kind of defend a more traditional stance of debate, right? So like if the negative is reading framework, or if the negative is making a lot of competition theory presses, or it's just going for presumption. This is the negative that I'm assuming. But also it could be assuming a negative that is also engaging in like the criticism that like links to your literature, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be a phrase that y'all hear from me a lot. I don't know. It's like a little couch phrase of mine, et cetera, but whatever. But the framing matters a lot. So with that, without a solid framing foundation, your affirmative loses much of its solvency mechanism. You'll need to set up the why and what, and also what this debate is and what the negative is proposing already misses the point at the level of form, not content. That might be an interesting, kind of thought, because I think that we're always thinking like content over form. But I think that there is something very important about the form, right? The kind of interruption that the AF does play in the debate that needs to be recognized and needs to be centered in the debate. And I think that oftentimes folks kind of run from this because they either want to have kind of a moment in the counter interpretation for why their content, is accessible to the negative, and why the kind of form of framework is bad, and blah, 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 blah. I don't think that you can't make these arguments and not explain why the literal introduction of the 1AC would not have happened minus you being affirmative, but also what is the AF given how you have stated the way that debate operates and works, right? Like if we are talking kind of pedagogically about the kind of mores and cultures of competition, and thinking of it as a game, and thinking of kind of how people perceive and read the 1AC, right? There is two kind of worlds that exist. A world that accepts that framing and however your literature or whatever your arguments are for how you have kind of encapsulated debate as operating as, right? Or there is the world in which you let that thing fly. We just accept it. We accept it. And then everything that you read in the 1AC is solely read through it being resistant, or solely it being read as it being outside of the realm of debate. And that probably is violent, right? In the context of your arguments. So what is the affirmative? What role does it play in the analysis that you have made about debate? And then dovetail that with what were the alternative way, like what were the negative consequences of not engaging in the way that you did, given, right, the way in which debate works. Does that make sense, y'all? Kind of first bullet point.
Yes.
Okay, great. So then the second bullet point, right, is having two levels to the affirmative is advantageous. I would say, the impact turn route or counter method slash, sorry, that's two different ones. So there's the impact turn route, or there's like the counter method slash pick out of kind of negative traditional framing, or framing in a particular sociocultural context. Now, if you have questions about this, I have an entire slide about this that will kind of delve into more. But the part that you should be taking away from this portion is that I think that there needs to be more than just waiting for the negative to say things and then you just kind of impact turning it all, right? I think that that's more kind of part of the capture and response portion of what the AF can do, and just proving why the negative is just proving your arguments. But I still have questions as to like, what is the kind of unique value of the AF outside of being caught in this catch and response nature of waiting for the negative to say stuff to prove why the AF is good? Does that sentence, that statement make sense, right? Like the being stuck in the kind of echo chamber of waiting for the negative to say things to impact turn that then become the AF, which usually is what happens. The impact turn becomes what the AF is. and less of like actually what was the initial instance of the 1AC in terms of how you now think about competition, how the affirmative is now reading what the role of debate is, how the affirmative exists within this new role. Those are two separate things. Y'all can give me a thumbs up if that like makes sense. Those are two separate things. Impact turn debate, that is the F, versus you have set up a new kind of guideline for how and what debate is, how it should function, and how the AF's role exists within this new guideline. Cool. So let's talk about solvency. So the method of the AF, is it symbolic? Is it conversational? Is it normal? And what I meant by normal is that understand what kind of AF you're reading. If your AF is just a whole bunch of cards that are critiquing the resolution, you're pretty normal. And like I put normal in the print or quotation marks because this is where like the spectrum of like what is a performance AF, like we see that. Because you are essentially just impact turning different portions of the resolution, which in very many ways is predictable, but is also not the same as an affirmative that is symbolic or is conversational. And by conversational, I mean affirmatives that take more of the agonistic type of, ballroom, cookout, just kind of creating a new frame for discussing and, requiring an active live time response from the affirmative that is not based off of, right, whatever was prepared before the round, right, but now is about the kind of conversations that happen once the interruption of the AF take place. Right. So now it's more like, what are you about to say? What are you going to say at the cookout? What are you going to say in the ballroom? What are you going to say? And like how the act incorporates, those live time responses as being part of the argument for itself. Right. And then more symbolic, like this is all of the kind of like immaterial material kind of pushes. Like if the AF is not just like the res is bad. And like there's a part of the res that talks about, if we're talking about antitrust, for example, like corporatism, if you're one big like cap KF, that's what I mean by normal. But if you're like something that's kind of more talking about, I don't know the literature fully on the topic is, but like just having more kind of ephemeral / visceral conversations about corporatism that kind of move away from antitrust or move away from solely being about kind of top level stuff within the topic, but move to conversations about debate, right? Move to conversations about power within the kind of vocational activity of speaking things into power and the choices that we make with the alternative, having, a live time result, right? That we choose to orient ourselves this way because whatever comes from what comes after the because, if it is symbolic, right? Because the AF doesn't defend the actual, if there's some alternatives or solvency arguments that you can't like actually do, but are more so thought projects, right? Like in the sense of, being more high theory or being something more of like, I don't know, I'm thinking like semiocap. I'm thinking for the folks who are doing this Baudrillard, Deleuze type, business, or folks who are doing more kind of Afro-pessimist things, you're not necessarily, engaging in the full apparatus of your method, but rather you are saying how the kind of apparatus of your method fully entangles itself within the context of the way in which debate operates and why affirming that particular method is key to kind of reframe and change the way in which, debate is able to orient itself to the AF or orient itself to certain types of arguments, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, y'all, et cetera, et cetera. You're just gonna have to get with the times. So there's that. And then next is that having a strong framing foundation sets the stage for what and how much the AF needs to solve for. And so this matters, right? Because I think oftentimes this is coming down to, is there a goal point to the affirmative or is there not? Is the AF just a question of like being here, right? And that kind of emergence in and of itself is that kind of emergence in and of itself is powerful, and like something that just is, it would not have been present absent the reading of the 1AC, and that matters for whatever reason you have isolated that matters. Or does the app actually do something that we can like chart and say that is good and is able to overcome a uniqueness argument that you have made about the way in nature that the world works, that debate works, et cetera, et cetera. Set those parameters for the affirmative. And don't let the negatives set them by reading a framing argument, in the 1NC that forces you to kind of like decide what does the affirmative have to defend or win. I would suggest that you start thinking of this now. You start thinking about what is the role and goal, if there is one, of the AF, and what does that mean that you have to win or that you have to meet. And I think that'll be helpful, because then affirmatives that are doing all this extra stuff of, spotting these links to disads and spotting these counterplan debates, or, just taking up, like the AF has to solve for the kind of entirety of an instance of anti-Blackness, or an entire instance of the ways in which language is formulated and, kind of put into, systems of whatever coherency arguments that you're making, right? Like maybe the AF doesn't have to do all that. Maybe it's okay that the AF doesn't do all that. And maybe setting up framing arguments that establish what actually the AF's kind of role and why that role is important is good, is sufficient, and that is enough. Wait, I have something in the chat. So yeah, so that's et cetera is my thing. That sucks. It's not really, cool. But the third thing is make sure to have explicit impacts in the language of the affirmative. I think this helps for two things. One, to have explicit impacts, right, that are unique to the affirmative. This is not new to y'all. Y'all know that you should have external impacts that are kind of isolated at the top of the 2AC. But I think that this also helps for the second kind of reason, in that it helps connect the story of the AF a lot more, right? So like framing to impacts, you are explaining the AF still in the language of whatever theory, whatever vibe, whatever moment that the AF needs to be, right? And it connects it all together so that I understand the full story of the 1AC, what its importance is, what it needs to solve for, and having the impact arguments as outlined based off of that perspective before even beginning to engage in whatever it is that the negative has said. I think the third thing is it also makes it also kind of gives the vibe that the negative hasn't responded to that impact, right? Like if you explain it within the context of your framing and in the language of your literature or in the language of your strategy, it makes it like a separate thing that the negative has to come to and explicitly respond as, instead of being like, oh, this is just a floating like education disad, or is a floating, fairness argument. No, it's like, nope, this is tied to our particular framing, our way in which like solvency operates. You got to come to us. And it just allows for the act to feel fuller and more complete, and the negative having to more so engage at the level of your form, which is always going to be disadvantageous to them, right? Because they want to kind of sap your ability to have the kind of form arguments via whatever, framework or kind of competition args or presumption, et cetera, et cetera. Not et cetera, et cetera. Oh gosh, this is going on YouTube, so this is going to be great for folks to see my idiosyncrasies. Any questions before we move to the next, y'all? This is just all making sense. I'm batting 4 for 4. Okay, I'll take it. Oh, I see in the chat. 4 for 4. I'll take it. All right. So Thoughts on responding. So I'm kind of intermingling this like with negative / affirmative thoughts, depending on at what point are these arguments introduced in the round, right? So like if you are on the side of the debate, we're like, what is this F? What do I do? How do I conceptualize beginning to think about responding? I'm kind of going in and out between those things. So the first is, what are the particular bright lines of the performance of the 1AC's intervention in the debate space? I am a big bright line person. I think that there is, and you'll see that I wrote it down here, right? There's a difference between like the idea of a performance and the performance itself. And if I did not write that entire language down, I would definitely write that down, right? It's like, if the affirmative is defending the kind of idea of some kind of immaterial form of dissuasion, what is the particular immaterial form of dissuasion that the AF is defending in the context of debate and in the context of this round? And does that have to solve something or no? Versus any litany of examples of dissuasion or non-info overload or whatever it is that the performance or critical interrogation of the affirmative is, because I think that this does set up arguments for predictability, for fairness, that have nothing to do about like framework if that's not what you want to do. I think it can supercharge, if you are somebody who reads framework, right, those debates. But I also think that like it just is a very fair question to be like, you have set the stage for what this debate is. You have set the stage for why the AF is unique. What is the unique instance of the performance as read together with your framing and solvency and kind of in goal point of the 1AC, and not just the kind of idea of that performance or idea of that being good to counteract every other kind of instance of the world or of debate. This is where affirmatives are a little light, which is fair, because like oftentimes that question is not asked because like the predictability, fairness kind of arg is more so about the like literature, right? Like how is that literature predictable, and less of like, how has the way in which the F has particularly, we got it, framed itself, right? Something that the negative can engage with. Does that distinction make sense, y'all? This whole like idea of the performance versus the performance itself, tying to framing, all of that stuff. I don't hear anything, I'm gonna assume yeah. Thank you, Ronick, for the math. So the next is the AF or neg, depending on which side of the argument is being ran, defending the idea of its methodology, or I've already kind of set up this conversation, right? Or are there specific tenets of the performance / method that are unique to the affirmative strategy that have bounded limitations that can be debated? I think that cross-ex matters a lot during this moment of kind of thinking about the strategy. And I also think that it helps with kind of forcing the affirmative to defend something and being able to spot an affirmative that has thought itself all the way from framing down to solvency to goals. There's a lot of times, right, the affirmative is just waiting for the negative to say something and to then base its entire kind of framing and kind of solvency off of that response. But that seems to be the argument of the negative, right? That the AF require, in terms of like, we'll get to like the competition portions, that there needs to be some kind of space for the negative to engage, you know, in making the burden of kind of rejoinder, and that the AF has that kind of burden of proof of bright lines, proof of like what you're locking yourself down to, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just like, I'm noticing it more. But that it really kind of melds itself really well with the negative. And I would also say to track, right, how the affirmatives kind of fluctuations in responding to the negative happen to prove and set up some of these competition arguments. Because like I said earlier, a lot of the times the 1AC just becomes the impact turn to the negative, and that becomes why the AF is important and good. But it's like, that was not what the 1AC was. You just kind of took the language of the AF, applied it to whatever the negative did, and less of like, but what does the AF do uniquely? And kind of really pushing on that substantiating a lack thereof of bright lines, or the bright line that the AF has to commit itself to really locks the AF into having to be specific to that. But I think that an affirmative that knows its framing, that has picked out what its goal is, or if there is a goal, and has kind of asked the question of why it is uniquely good and key to being affirmative in this moment, in the context of debate, in the context, of the conversations that are being had, that's not a problem. It just means now we know the kind of rooted places that the AF is in and that the neg is in, or maybe not the neg as much because the neg gets more options, right? But at least the neg knows where the AF is, the AF knows where the AF is, and we know where this debate can happen. So there's that. Competition, let's talk about it. So this is potentially one of the most important outside of like for the AF framing, but like between the affirmative and negative, I think this is the most important part of the debate. The framing part of the debate helps emphasize and grant saliency to whichever side's competition argument is most warranted and impacted in the debate. So like if you are correct about kind of the microcosm of debate, right? Understanding it all the way down to like the majoritarian culture, explaining to me kind of how the rules, or, how we're supposed to accept the rules is coded or directed by some form of, repressive power or whatever system of kind of institutions that you are critiquing. That if you are correct about that, that should also be part of how you are critiquing competition standards, right, in debate. But I think that when the affirmative has framing and says what the goals of the F actually are, what the bright lines of the F actually are, you got a lot better of an answer to kind of like, what does it mean for the negative to engage you, right? And we'll talk more kind of in a little bit about what maybe some answers to that question are. I want to kind of brainstorm with you all. But I think that kind of breaking it down to your framing, applying to kind of competition is helpful. The other is that how does the judge resolve the debate under this new sociocultural model that the AF has proposed? That part I will also say is hard. I think oftentimes it's like a blip in the 2AC. It's like a roll of the ballot, or like I'm just supposed to assume that if you win your framing, then that means something. But then what does that, like, I'm asking for the connective tissue that is, you win your framing. So what does that mean about how I should be evaluating this new system of, analyzing the debate? Like those are two different things. And I would ask for, affirmatives to help out with that, and the negative too. But this feels more generative than it does I keep on saying response as a response or like a rejoinder, but I think the more that you can make the affirmative feel generative, the better, unless like that is completely antithetical to your argument and you don't want it to be generative. But I do think that like you can like have like productivity bad args and still have a generative aspect of the affirmative, because it took you affirming something for me to understand why productivity is bad, right? For example. So it doesn't mean that like you are saying that productivity is good and that you're producing this endless stream of new debates. You're just telling me like, what did the AF do outside of the negative being here and you critiquing the negative? And so does that evaluation resolve the framing arguments, this new world or this new place, or not even new? And I actually want to change my language on new, because that presumes, right, that like the majoritarian kind of way of thought is the only thing within existence, and therefore the only way that can be conceptualized with like, as what exists right now in debate. And you have made arguments as to there is something to the sides of this kind of normative thought. So it's not new, it just also exists. And you as the minoritarian, right, have also existed. and have also postulated kind of the different or alternative way of thinking about competition and thinking about what the role of the affirmative is, not as a new tendency, but as something always already on the periphery that is rather being affirmed and emerged, right? That always is going to provide some form of tension to the traditional way in which competition framing, the role of the affirmative, the role of the negative has been accepted, projected, forced as. And next question is, does that evaluation recreate the harms the app is attempting to solve, right? So, because sometimes the app has not I want to say the app hasn't fully thought about how this evaluation is part of what you also are critiquing, but sometimes it is, right? Like if you're saying that the judge should base it off of, what if you're light on what does this kind of counter way of evaluating the debate and just like what is it? If you are relying on debate to grant you kind of offense defense paradigms, then like in some ways you are kind of being antithetical to what you have just critiqued. And so in order for the judge to evaluate, offense in the debate, or in order for the judge to evaluate like the app being successful could be in contradiction to the stuff that you have framed at the top. And that is also an entry point for the negative, right? Where if the app is light in being able to kind of defend what this alternate kind of competition framing is, and the only way to kind of evaluate the debate, this is Sam's even framework. This is literally just like burden of proof, burden of rejoinder. What does it mean to be negative? How are we, evaluating, the app solving? Is the app solving, something that is good, et cetera? Yo. But does this kind of evaluative schema that you have asked the judge to be participant in something that is, in contradiction to what you have set this debate up to be? Are you fully committed to being alternate, essentially? Are you fully committed to that? Are you fully committed to framing the entirety of the 1AC through this kind of challenging analytic? Last is there room to negate the app under this new model or alternate model? Is there room? Should there be? I'm 50-50 on it, right? Like, and I know other judges could be 70-30. I think the point really being that there are people who want to know that this can be negated. And I have some thoughts to this moment in particular here, because I think that in some ways that it's justified to kind of just throw out that app has not provided a role for the negative. But I think that also comes down to like the app not really having thought down fully its construction. But I also think that this can be a lazy argument from the negative in that, well, did you not take it from the top? Because the app started with, statements about the world and debate and how the debate should be framed. Have you disagreed with that portion? Because if you disagree with that portion, like anything, right? Framework, structures the threshold of the link arguments. And so in this world, framework, which, words are hard. Framework would structure the threshold of app solvency and, what the app has to do or what the app even has to be. That if you've conceded that, then yeah, it's going to be a hard place being negative. But maybe the debate exists at the framing level, maybe, and this could be the framework debate, maybe, or it could be at some point in the middle, right? Of, okay, now that the app has kind of created the baseline for what debate is and how it operates, does the app have bright lines for itself? And creating competition standards based off the lack thereof that, or why maybe the bright lines that the app has kind of created are not what the literature or kind of the argument that they are making is not consistent. That can be something, or, you're just taking the approach to read another critique versus the affirmative. All of these things come into play with each other. Part two, and this is where the negative has an opportunity to reframe the debate to their advantage and to reveal the ways in which, one, there is no way to evaluate the AF in their solvency and framing require within the scope of the debate. So some thoughts there, kind of also what I've already stated, right, is that if they have framed the world in debate to operate in a particular way, in the way in which they have left the kind of evaluative portion of the debate light, then they have not escaped really the part that they are critiquing, but have rather, in the words of me, put the razzle dazzle, right, of the importance of the affirmative, but not done the kind of bottom layer work of what to do with that razzle dazzle that is good or that is part of the kind of framing that they have set up. How do we evaluate this AF? Do we evaluate this AF? Is the role and goal to evaluate or to metricize the affirmative? Or is the role and goal to view what the negative does in response? Because it's more a test of the negative than it is a test to the AF. Why is that good? Why is that bad? Debate to be had. Two is that the evaluation of the affirmative will be resolved within the majoritarian scope because it's lack of counter evaluation framing, some stuff that I said above, right? I think that number one, if there's no way to evaluate the AF, it's like, thank you, vote neg on presumption, right? So it's like AF has been introduced. It's better to not evaluate the affirmative, right? Because you will have arguments as to why that is bad. That can look like, ballot K args, that can look like co-optimism arguments, it can look like ressentiment arguments, et cetera. I caught it. But it can look like those kind of arguments. Whereas number two, right, is more so making arguments that's like the way that the affirmative can only be tested or, kind of evaluated requires, some form of reasonable stasis. This can be your entry point into framework. This honestly could be used as an entry point to other critical arguments. That can be like where you sidebar me during office hours to ask kind of for thoughts for that, and thinking about more so like methodological questions about, AF-neg critical versus like particular arguments versus AFs, or particular arguments versus the neg that does stuff like this. And three is current rules on competition are good and open to be malleable, but only within the scope of traditional debate structure. Is the kind of, it has what the affirmative isolated the way in which debate works true? Does the kind of majoritarian culture not assume some level of, difference? Can there be contestation? Can there be some openness to the conversations, at least, that the affirmative wants to have, or even the form that the affirmative wants to have, that are not requiring an alternate way to evaluate the entirety of the debate? And if that is the case, maybe we keep the kind of way in which debate is evaluated, explain why, what the affirmative does is good, but not a reason for why the way in which debate should be evaluated should be changed is an option. So I thought, one second. All right, so I skipped this. So let's talk about this. I skipped this, right? I'm not going wild. I skipped this. Did I skip this?
Yeah, I think it was good.
Okay, good. Let's talk about it. So counter method, solvency pick stuff. So this is to the affirmative that, well, this is just like AF hat kind of strategy thinking, and thinking through the two levels of what the AF needs to have. If you remember this, wait, where did I? Yeah, having two levels to the affirmative, like I said, is advantageous, impact turn route, or the counter method pick route. So like, what do I mean by that? What goes on? I think that we all understand the impact turn route, right? So I'm not going to really spend some time explaining that, but more so speaking on what I mean by kind of counter method slash solvency pick, how is this kind of different from being locked into the echo chamber of waiting for what the negative does, and creating solvency based off of that? This is kind of what I've come up with. So this route for solvency requires the mechanism for the AF being better adapted to solve for the affirmative framing. So 1, what is the AF framing? And 2, what is the mechanism that the AF has endorsed that is in line with said framing, right? So what is the existence of the AF? What is the interruption of the 1AC? And why is that all part of the mechanism of the AF? The card that you read cannot solely be the mechanism. The vibe, entry point, and kind of purpose of the AF also needs to be part of the mechanism, because once again, the alternative to you reading it was no one reading it, and that should be taken into account. To the other part to that is that competition that is generated from this pick is usually based in rules of debate, or the resolution, or the physical, metaphysical space that debate is operating in that disagrees with either the affirmative or negative, depending on like what side you are when you're reading these arguments, that is not engaging in the performative debate. So essentially, right, you've made your framing arguments. You have kind of stated why the kind of rules of debate are bad, or why kind of the conversations of what the resolution wants us to have, or how the resolution wants us to have them, are bad. Or you have critiqued kind of the way, and you have also critiqued the physical space, the metaphysical space of debate, and how the negative or affirmative, once again, y'all understand what I mean by kind of going in between, depending on who's reading this argument, is operating within the space. Are they gatekeepers? Are they, kind of warranting the kind of operationalization, that word that I cannot say because words are hard. You're critiquing on some level that this is what the negative is doing. You're antithetical. So competition would be picking out of all these things, picking out of the rules, picking out of the res, picking out of something, right, that you have isolated in your framing, right, as being bad. And why the kind of indoctrination of the rules, or the indoctrination of the conversations of the resolution, or whatever, deny the performance of the 1AC, denies the interruption of the 1AC, and explaining why this interruption, why this performance happening now by you is important, and why whatever you have picked out of the level of like form, right? Because this is like a form v form debate in my mind. I always think like form v content. Yes, we can have the debate over like why content comes first or why form comes first, blah, 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 blah. But I do think that at some level, right, we are having a form v form debate. There are some disads that come with your form. There are some disads, at least what the negative will say, that come with, yours. And so I think taking it up on all right, we think that this performance is good if we win our framing and our framing and explaining the mechanism of debate as interruption and the unique kind of potential of the actual kind of card that explains what your method is as all part of the performance, and that if it did not happen in the 1AC, or if it just did not happen as an interruption, what are the kind of external impacts to that? And that's why as number 2, I have explicit and external impacts to the affirmative or negative are needed in order to flesh out the unique role that performance has, right? Because maybe you're making arguments as to why the performance kind of reveals particular tendencies of debate and the negative that otherwise would have been muted or mutable, right? Because there would not have been anything to expose the ways in which, conversations about particular, subgroups or subcategories, or, just people, would happen, right? Because we would all assume we know how to properly engage and have conversations that are not objectifying or parasitic about folks, or we know how to, not say things that are probably messed up or whatever. But your performance is what generates that moment, and to verify whether or not you are in a space that is conducive conducive to the idea that absent you, there would have been someone to read the 1AC, or there would have been someone else to interrupt. But, right, your kind of arc of what it exposes means that the goal is for the negative to be repressive to the performance, supercharging all of your kind of external impacts to why the AF not happening, the performance, the interruption not happening, and there literally not being an alternative option because it would not have been read. The interruption would not have happened. The majoritarian would have won, right, as being bad. Are there any questions to that, y'all? Because that is a little convoluted, but I don't think too convoluted, but I also could be very much so wrong. Now we're on the same page. We're vibing. Need some kind of words. Okay, so we're good. Anyone else? So Brian's good. Jeremy's good. Who else is good? It's only 2 people of like the 10 folks who are here. I need a few more goods. Faith is good. Lauren's good. Okay. All right. Cool. I hope to see some of this stuff, y'all, in these practice debates that we're going to be having. Did that. All right. So let's talk about it. Kind of right after the competition slides that we had. So this is me asking you all questions and part of an interactive portion of this lecture. That is, and actually I'm going, would y'all prefer for this part to be recorded as well? Because this is going to go on YouTube, but would y'all want this part to kind of listen into what folks would respond to these questions with as like a recording? Y'all in your agnostic ways. Okay, sure, we'll keep it recorded. So let's talk about it. What is your response to what the role of the affirmative and negative is during cross-ex? Can somebody give me some responses that they give? Or a few folks? If you are reading a critical affirmative and that question is asked to you, what are you usually saying? Anybody take the floor. Do not be shy. So I know a lot of y'all have read critical affirmatives and this question has been asked to you. So I do believe in call out culture. So if you do not offer yourself, I will offer you respectfully. Gonna give it like 5 more seconds.
I mean, I haven't had a round in a while, but one answer that comes to mind is that, like, I guess like a role of the affirmative would be to, affirm some departure from the status quo.
Away.
The negative would be to negate that departure. I think that, like, granted, I don't know if I've like explicitly used that articulation of roles before, but at least in my mind, it kind of charts a path that includes affirmatives that are both policy and non-policy. And if you want to be a stickler, you could say that departure from the status quo needs to be grounded in some resolution or something, and that would bring you into the policy side of things. But that's like my 2 cents.
Okay. So departure from, I'm gonna write some of this stuff down so that I can kind of get some thoughts to it. But while I'm writing that down, someone else want to say what they say?
For me, I'm still thinking about it, but I think it's been more the role of the affirmative is to, well, just broadly to present some sort of like, I guess, well, in the context of as I ran before, it's been to affirm a scholarship or to like present some way in round to generate knowledge just on that level. And then it's the burden of the negative to interact with it in a way that isn't, to interact with the literature essentially, instead of like framework arguments, let's just put it like that. that it's your job, it's our job to present some sort of critical knowledge, or that it's your job to combat that as directly as possible.
Okay. Got it. Anyone else?
The role of the negative is to disprove the affirmative or provide a counter strategy for solving the affirmative's harms that is net beneficial.
Wait, say that again.
The role of the negative is to either disprove the affirmative or to provide a counter method / strategy that solves the affirmative's harms while being net beneficial.
Okay. The initial question that I asked is kind of what is the role of the affirmative though? You got the role of the negative. What is the role of the affirmative?
Well, the role of the affirmative, I guess, that we used to read on the counterintuitive debate was to defend an orientation towards carcerality in debate, but that was about the CJR topic, so it's not universal.
I'm gonna put a critical effect over as to state. Anyone else? I'm writing all these down.
Last year I read like a very weird, like quasi-topical app, and what we mostly ended up saying was just like the role of the affirmative is to affirm the resolution in whatever way that means to them. The role of the negative is to negate that form of affirmation.
Say that one more time. Sorry, I don't write that fast.
Oh yeah. The role of the affirmative is to affirm in like whatever way it means to them, and the role of the negative is to negate that style or, you know, that affirmation in whichever way they would like to as well.
Anyone else before I have some thoughts?
We would always say, in response to that question, like something along the lines of the topic as like a preemptive framework. So something like the role of the AF is to create a change with a method in like whatever the topic area was. And then the role of the negative would be to negate the AF or to like provide some sort of counter methodology that's better to solve the AF.
Okay. Cool. So I'm gonna kind of go down the list of what was given, and just to give some thoughts. I think that honestly, these are good. So this was not like a trick, question of, oh no, have I been doing this all wrong my entire life? No. But more so to kind of just converse about it, what ways, and kind of thinking about what this means through what we just discussed, right, with like the lecture, and are there ways to tinker with it to be a bit more selfish? Because like in how I'm listening to it right now, it's a little middle of the road, and I think that that's strategic for when you have judges, right, that require this, but I do think that in that initial crossfix moment that you do get to be a bit more selfish and then get to, pare down when you finally kind of listen to the negative strategy, right? Because what if framework is not read and now you have made it solely about departing from the resolution, and you now spotted a link argument to the negative if their argument is about like, your theory being a kind of contingent act from a kind of liberal structure is bad. Maybe you have seen these arguments in the context of pessimism, maybe you haven't, but I think that we can be a little bit more selfish. So the first was that it's a departure from the status, or the affirmative needs to be a departure from the status quo, and maybe it's a departure from the the resolution, or from the resolution, or within the resolution. If we're being like Jeremy said, a bit nitpicky in terms of being as resolutionally close to mentioning the resolution as we can. I think that this is like fine, right? That the affirmative should be a departure from the SQO. I guess the question to it, right, is what about the particular, and maybe you can provide some kind of context for what the AF was and what the departure was, and is departure the right word for it? Jeremy, you there?
I was muted.
Oh, got it.
Let's see. I mean, I'm trying to think. The AF I read last year was about the relationship between genocide in the Philippines and domestic policing, right? And the way that like we test and then our policing strategies on like colonial subjects before importing them back to the United States. The method in that debate was like, I think it was this Maxwell card about post memory. And so I don't think that probably departed too much from the status quo, because it was more of just like an understand this relationship type affirmative. But a different AF that might be more applicable is the year before that I'd read a BFO AF where we were just like the resolution tries to like homogenize ways of being in debate. And we propose like poetics as a way for us to like reconceptualize our research or our participation's activity different. So that would be that kind of departure from the status quo. The status quo of debate is this kind of mechanistic focus on like the most efficient form of policy, then our status quo, then our departure would be shifting the focus to about how we can like be together through things like music or poems.
Got it. So I think honestly that like even my introduction to when I started reading critical arguments is like the response is that the burden of proof, right? Does the AF kind of reasonably kind of create a shift from the status quo? I do think though, like that's fine, but it seems as though it's only directed towards like the world, right? And like the world, I mean by like politics. Is the affirmative a departure from the status quo in debate as well?
I mean, I think so. We were like playing music in rounds and like, or at least I think so at the time that it was a departure in debate. I can't say we were too successful at always winning that it was, but I'd like to think it was.
Okay, heard you. I think that that's kind of at least the like if we're textually to say departure from the status quo, functionally asking if you're also making those arguments kind of separate too, right? That you can be a departure from the status quo in terms of what if that's about the resolution, right? Like how the resolution asks us to have conversations about if it's policing, forgot what the topic was before that, or was it immigration, right?
No, before CJR was arms sales.
Yeah, right. That was
arms sales CJR.
You said what?
It was education, immigration, arms sales CJR.
Got it. Heard you. So I think that textually this is fine. I'm just interested in honestly in seeing these practice debates too. What and how that kind of designation between the resolution departure and the debate departure, how you would frame this. Because I think that with the text that you have, that's fine. And I'm not putting you on the spot to do that work right now. I'm just saying that kind of notes for when you start having these practice debates with us. I'm interested to see how you separate the two. How is the AF a departure from the status quo in the context of conversations from the res, if that's what the departure is, right? And then how is it a departure from the status quo in the context of debates relationship to the stuff that you have introduced? Because I think that those are two separate questions, or those are two separate and distinct, departures that the AF would be playing a role in. Because one is like, it begs the question of like the content, right? The departure from the status quo. Do you think that the kind of conversation and content of the AF is key, needed, good for being this kind of strategy against what normative kind of conversations about the resolution are? That's one thing. But then it's like, but then how does debate function operate that gets us away from being able to have conversations like that? Or how does debate operate just in line of the theory that you have introduced, and why the form of the AF within how you have outlined debate operating is also a departure? Does that make sense as it being a distinction?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I'm hoping so, because that is what, also for this activity that we're going to be doing at 1 o'clock, what I will be looking forward to seeing. Next one, affirm the scholarship of the AF. This is yours, Faith. So basically, I have it written out. It's just like the AF should get to affirm its scholarship and interact with a negative that engages that literature methodologically, and basically a way to kind of containerize framework out of the conversation. The only disad, right, that like I see to kind of this being the response is that affirm the scholarship can be a little bit nebulous in that, what does that mean, right? To like any scholarship, all scholarship, does that tell me fully what the affirmative is, or what the affirmative's orientation or role that the affirmative needs to be? Like I picked up a book, right? And I said, the book said capitalism is bad, and I have affirmed that capitalism is bad. Is that what the AF is though, right? Like, is that the form of the AF? Just to say that capitalism is bad, and that all you have to win in the debate is whatever scholarship that got us to that statement. That's kind of the only, when the negative reads all these kind of like predictability arguments, right? But I even think outside of the negative, how does that really get us to what the affirmative is, right? And bright lines, right? Of what does the affirmative have to defend itself in the entirety of the round? I think that if the AF is just scholarship, I think it takes away some valuable portions of what the 1AC existed to be in the first place. The other part of like, and therefore the negative has to engage with that literature, like that also can be an infinite amount of things, because that makes it more of like a content thing rather than a form thing, right? And I do think that like it could mean a lot of, I don't think it controls what the negative can or cannot do, because I think that they can spin it, right, as like, well, yeah, you can have your conversations about, let's say, capitalism being bad, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to read disads to that. We're not able to read disads to that because you don't defend the resolution, right? So it's like that, reading those disads in theory would be interacting with your thesis at a literature level, but I am presuming, right, because you said no framework, but that's not really what you want them to be able to like get to. So I would shift this from being more so affirm, insert the particular scholarship of the affirmative, but then the orientation that the affirmative has within that scholarship, right? So if you are a kind of poetic intervention, right, you're a poetic intervention in the debate space, and maybe you are making arguments about poesis, for example, right, that you would affirm the kind of poetic intervention, right, of a insert what you have isolated the debate space as being, anti-poesis or anti, collaborative or whatever, anti-Black, and therefore justifies why the affirmation of a poetic intervention, it happened, right, is what the method, the form that the AF takes up, and kind of just contextualizes, why that is the case. So that's how I would think through kind of that response. And what that then means for the negative, well, it kind of just shifts the goal point, and the negative just has to negate that intervention or has to defend why a non-poesis space is good or why debate is not, but that's a debate, right, to be had. But if you win, then I like these moments of, if we win the theory or if we win our argument that debate is this, the AF defends its itself as an affirmation of a poetic intervention, the role of the negative is to negate, right, from the stance of disagreeing with that framing or proving why that framing is compatible with whatever it is they want to negate the F with. So I'm going to leave you there with some thoughts to think of that through, and like literally include whatever kind of scholarship or arguments that are most, for what you have been researching and looking at. The next one, the role of the negative, a lot of commas. The role of the negative is either to disprove whose was this? Who was after Faith? Who told me this one? The role of the negative is either to, was this you, Ronick?
Yeah.
Can you just say yours again? Writing is hard.
Yeah, I think it's the role of the negative is to either disprove the affirmative or provide a counter strategy / methodology that is net beneficial to the affirmative.
You do that. I'm sorry. The first part, I got the last part. The first part, the role of the negative is either to disprove the methodology of the app.
Yeah, the role of the negative is to either not just methodology, it's to disprove the affirmative, i.e. presumption, or the competitive stuff, which is like setting up competition standards, yada yada.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fun. I think that's good. I think that's good. I think that I just still have the kind of like question of what the AF defends, right? And that's not to say that like that response in cross-ex is not sufficient. I think that it is. I just think that like once like the 2AC is happening and we're kind of having in quicker speed, right? This kind of competition, presumption, debate, what is the AF? Why is it uniquely good outside of like the negative, not kind of creating competition with it? What the role of the AF is in debate still is a question that I have.
Yeah. This is, I guess, is more for like setting up competition in the context of like AF asks like in cross-ex like a framework team's like, what do we get to read against you? And it's like, this is what you get. I guess the argument, I guess the role of the AF is like, in my head, is a little bit more topic dependent, or like whatever your counterintuitive framework is on like how to understand affirmatives. So but
before framework is read, like I think that you're able to add, of course, right? Like I think that the 2AC gets to add stuff, right? Because you don't know what the 1NC is until the 1NC happens and the 2AC is a constructive. But like before the framework is introduced, if you were just asked, what is the role of the affirmative?
Well, I don't know. I still think that framework is kind of relevant to that, or at least understanding your orientation towards framework is kind of relevant to that, because at least it sets the terrain for like what the role of the AF is, i.e. the AF, we had read an AF that was like Moten-esque, and it was about tracing like genealogies of carcerality both within debate and outside of debate. An argument is we need to have an orientation to carceral geographies within debate, and that was the counterinterpretation on at least framework that we read, but it also shaped what the role of the affirmative was, i.e. that sort of tracing and whatnot was a valuable scholarly production within the academic terrain of debate.
Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, I mean, get it 100%. And I think that last part is kind of like starting to get to the question of like, if I were like, not even like once again, not a framework thing, just like top level of the 2AC, when you're telling me kind of why the AF matters and what it needs to solve for, and why independently alone, I can think of the AF as something outside of, its relationship to the topic, because maybe the AF isn't related to the topic, right? Like that can be something that is allowed or could be what the AF is about. Things to consider. So I think that we're there. like we're right there, but I still have kind of outside of before framework is read, what is the affirmative kind of defending for itself, its relationship to debate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But okay, because I'm looking at the clock, we have 20 minutes before this activity. So I'm gonna give y'all what the activity is, because y'all need time to kind of prepare for it a little bit. So do we all have a pen and pencil or some kind of note-taking situation next to us? I'm assuming yes, because this. Right, so I'm gonna stop the recording so that people don't hear that no one cares about this part.